Welcome to our deep dive into Charlotte Mason's Parents and Children. We've got some excerpts from this book. I have to admit I hadn't heard of this book before.
Yeah, a lot of people haven't heard of this book. Charlotte Mason was this British educator kind of back in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and had some really kind of radical ideas about education.
Okay.
A lot of them are surprisingly relevant even today.
So set the stage for us. What was so revolutionary about her approach?
Well, for one thing, she saw education as more than just like stuffing facts into a child's brain. You know, she believed it was about forming the whole person, shaping their character and habits and really nurturing a love of learning.
Ah, so it's not just about academics, but about developing a child's character as well.
Right.
That makes sense. It reminds me of how we're finally starting to recognize the importance of things like social emotional learning in schools today.
Exactly. And Mason was way ahead of her time on this. She really pushed back against the idea that kids are just empty vessels waiting to be filled with knowledge. She argued that they're born with this innate desire to learn, to explore, to make sense of the world around them.
Yeah.
And that we should be tapping into that natural curiosity, not squashing it with rote memorization and dry lectures.
So how did she propose we do that? I mean, how do we actually tap into this natural curiosity? Did she have any specific methods or techniques?
She did. And this is where it gets really interesting. She talked a lot about the power of ideas as the sole educational instrument.
Okay, hold on. What exactly did she mean by ideas? Not just any old idea can be educational.
Right. She was talking about these big, powerful living ideas that you find embedded in great literature, history, art, music, nature, all the subjects that make up a rich and well-rounded education.
Okay.
Think of ideas like justice, truth, beauty, courage, sacrifice. These are the kinds of things that inspire us, that make us think differently, that shape our understanding of the world and our place in it.
So it's not about teaching kids about these ideas in some abstract way, but about exposing them to the ideas themselves through real, engaging experiences.
Yeah.
That sounds fascinating, but also pretty challenging. I mean, how do you actually do that?
Well, Mason was a huge advocate for what she called living books.
Okay.
These weren't textbooks or summaries, but the actual works of great authors, historians, scientists, the people who first grappled with these big ideas. She believed that by reading these books, children would encounter these ideas in their purest form, unfiltered and undiluted.
It's like getting knowledge straight from the source.
Exactly. And it's not just about passively absorbing these ideas either. Mason believed that children should be actively engaged with what they're reading, asking questions, making connections, forming their own opinions.
So it's about fostering critical thinking, not just memorizing facts. That resonates with a lot of modern educational approaches like inquiry-based learning.
Absolutely. And this focus on active learning connects to another one of Mason's key principles, the power of habit.
Okay, let's talk about habits. I feel like that's a word we hear a lot these days, but I'm curious to know how Mason approached it back then.
Well, she was drawing on some of the latest scientific understandings of the brain at the time, how it's physically shaped by repeated actions. She understood that habits once formed become almost like schoolmasters, guiding our thoughts and actions even when we're not consciously thinking about them.
So it's not just about telling kids what to do, but about helping them actually form the habits that will allow them to live a good and productive life. It's like building the right neural pathways, right?
That's a great way to put it. And Mason wasn't just talking about things like brushing your teeth or making your bed, though those are important too. She was talking about habits of mind, habits of attention, observation, reflection, self-control. These are the habits that underpin a truly disciplined life.
So how did you recommend we help children develop these habits?
Well, Mason was a big believer in the idea that we shouldn't be constantly telling kids what to do. She thought that was actually counterproductive. Instead, she advocated for creating the right environment and then letting children practice these habits through consistent, repeated actions.
Can you give us an example? How would that actually work in practice?
Sure. Take the habit of neatness. Instead of nagging a child to clean their room, you might provide them with clearly labeled drawers and shelves, making it easy for them to put things away in an orderly fashion. Then you establish a routine, maybe a set time each day for tidying up, and you help them stick to that routine until it becomes second nature.
So it's not about punishment or rewards, but about creating a structure that supports the desired behavior.
Exactly. It's about setting children up for success and then letting them experience the natural consequences of their actions, both positive and negative.
Okay, we'll definitely need to come back to this idea of natural consequences. It sounds interesting, but also maybe a bit controversial. But before we do, I'm curious to learn more about how Mason viewed the role of parents in all of this. I mean, it sounds like she was pretty hands-on.
Oh, absolutely. Mason saw parents as the primary educators of their children, especially in the early years. She believed that parents have a unique responsibility to shape their children's character, cultivate their habits, and nurture their love of learning.
That's a big responsibility, especially in today's world where parents are often juggling work, family, and all sorts of other demands. But Mason was writing over 100 years ago, right? Things were probably a bit different back then.
They were, but she was actually addressing a lot of the same anxieties that parents face today. For example, she was very critical of the competitive nature of education in her time, how it puts so much pressure on children to succeed in exams and outperform their peers.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing she wasn't a big fan of standardized testing?
Not at all. She felt that it stifled a child's natural love of learning, turning education into a high-stakes race to the top.
Yeah.
She believed that we should be focusing on nurturing a child's intrinsic motivation to learn, not on external rewards or punishments.
Okay, I'm really starting to see how her ideas are relevant to us today.
Yeah.
I'm almost afraid to ask. But what else did she have to say about the role of parents?
Well, she actually talked about the importance of parents forming their own habits of mind, of cultivating their own intellectual and spiritual lives.
Okay.
She believed that children learn best by example, and that parents who are themselves lifelong learners are best equipped to instill that same love of learning in their children.
So it's not just about what we teach our kids, but about who we are as people.
Yeah.
That's a powerful message. And speaking of powerful messages, I have to ask about this idea of the divine teacher that you mentioned earlier. It seems like such a unique concept, almost mystical.
Yeah.
Can you explain what Mason meant by that?
It is a unique concept,
Yeah.
and it's definitely one that requires some unpacking. Basically, Mason believed that there's a kind of spiritual dimension to all true learning, that we're not just acquiring knowledge, but connecting with something larger than ourselves.
Uh-huh.
She saw this divine teacher as a partner in that process, a source of inspiration, guidance, and illumination.
So it's not about religious indoctrination, but about recognizing that there's a kind of awe and wonder inherent in the pursuit of knowledge. It's like tapping into a deeper source of wisdom.
Exactly. And she believed that this connection with the divine teacher is what ultimately transforms education from a purely intellectual exercise into a truly spiritual journey.
Wow, that's a lot to think about. Feels like we've only just scratched the surface here.
We have, but I think this is a good place to pause and reflect on what we've learned so far.
I agree. And for all of you listening, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What's resonating with you so far? What questions are popping up for you? Hold on to those thoughts, because we're going to pick back up in part 2 of this deep dive, where we'll explore some more of Mason's practical tips and also delve deeper into some of her more challenging ideas. All right, we're back and ready to dive deeper into Charlotte Mason's Parents and Children. Before the break, we were talking about the divine teacher. I've got to admit, I'm still kind of wrapping my head around that concept.
It is a bit mind-bending, isn't it? But if we think about it less in religious terms and more as this idea of tapping into a deeper source of wisdom and inspiration, it starts to kind of click a little more.
Yeah, that's helpful. And you mentioned that Mason saw this divine teacher as being present in all kinds of learning, not just religious education, right?
Exactly. Remember how she talked about ideas being the real educational tools? Well, she believed that those powerful ideas, things like truth, beauty, justice, have a kind of spiritual essence to them. They're not just abstract concepts, but forces that can shape our understanding and even our actions.
So it's like these big ideas are almost like invitations from the divine teacher to engage with something bigger than ourselves.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And Mason believed that this divine teacher is always present, waiting for us to tune in to become receptive to those invitations.
That's pretty profound. And it makes me think about the kind of learning experiences that really stay with us, the ones that shape who we are at a fundamental level. Those moments often feel like more than just absorbing information, right?
Absolutely. There's a sense of awe, of mystery, of connecting with something bigger than ourselves. And Mason believed that those are the kinds of learning experiences that truly transform us.
So how do we as parents or educators create those kinds of experiences for children? I mean, it's not like we can just conjure up a sense of awe on demand, right?
Right, it's not about forcing anything. But Mason believed that we can create the conditions that make those experiences more likely to happen. And one of the key ingredients is, believe it or not, discomfort.
Discomfort. Really? I feel like our instinct as parents is to shield our kids from discomfort as much as possible.
I know, it seems counterintuitive. But Mason argued that by trying to protect children from all discomfort, we're actually doing them a disservice. We're preventing them from developing the resilience and resourcefulness they need to navigate the challenges of life.
Okay, I'm intrigued, but also a little bit skeptical. Can you give us an example of what this looks like in practice? Because I'm having a hard time imagining intentionally making my kids uncomfortable.
Well, think about it this way. We all experience discomfort in life, right? Physical discomfort, emotional discomfort, intellectual discomfort. It's part of being human. And if we don't learn how to cope with those discomforts, they can overwhelm us.
That's true. But kids seem especially sensitive to discomfort, don't they? I mean, a scraped knee can feel like the end of the world to a 5-year-old.
Of course. And we should always respond with compassion and care when our children are hurting. But Mason's point is that we shouldn't try to prevent all discomfort. In fact, she believed that even small discomforts, if handled well, can be opportunities for growth.
Okay, I'm starting to see where you're going with this. So it's not about being harsh or insensitive, but about teaching kids how to cope with the inevitable bumps and bruises of life.
Exactly, and this connects back to her emphasis on habit formation. If we can help children develop habits of resilience, of perseverance, of not giving up when things get tough, we're giving them invaluable tools for navigating life's challenges.
Makes sense. So how do we actually do that? How do we help kids build those kinds of habits?
Well, Mason was a big believer in letting children experience the natural consequences of their actions.
Ah, natural consequences. That's a phrase I've heard a lot in parenting circles. But I have to admit, it can be a tough one to put into practice.
I hear you. It's definitely not always easy. But Mason believed it's essential for children to learn that their choices have consequences, both positive and negative, and that those consequences are a natural part of life, not some arbitrary punishment imposed by adults.
Okay, can you give us an example of what this looks like in real life?
Sure. Imagine a child who refuses to wear a coat on a chilly day. Instead of forcing them to wear it or lecturing them about the dangers of catching a cold, you might simply let them go outside without it.
Oh, I see where you're going with this. They might get cold and uncomfortable, but they'll also learn a valuable lesson about listening to their body and making wise choices.
Exactly. And the next time they're faced with a similar situation, they'll be more likely to remember the discomfort they experienced and make a different choice. They'll have learned through experience, not through lectures or punishments.
That's a great example. But I can imagine some parents pushing back on this approach. What about situations where the consequences could be more serious? Like what if the child runs into the street without looking?
Of course, there are limits to this approach. We're not talking about putting children in danger. In situations where safety is a concern, we absolutely need to intervene and set clear boundaries. But Mason's point is that there are many everyday situations where we can safely allow children to experience the natural consequences of their choices.
It's about finding that balance between protecting them and allowing them to learn and grow through experience.
Exactly. And it's not just about physical consequences either. Mason believed that natural consequences apply to social and emotional situations as well.
Can you give us an example?
Sure. Imagine a child who's constantly interrupting others. Instead of constantly reprimanding them, you might simply stop paying attention when they interrupt. Or you might say something like, "I'll be happy to listen to you when I'm finished talking."
So they're experiencing the natural consequence of their actions, not getting the attention they're seeking.
Precisely. And over time, they'll learn that interrupting is not an effective way to get their needs met. They'll start to develop habits of patience and respect for others.
It's fascinating how this all ties back to her emphasis on habit formation. It's like, by allowing children to experience the natural consequences of their actions, we're helping them build the habits that will allow them to thrive in life.
Exactly. It's about fostering a sense of agency and responsibility rather than creating an environment where children feel constantly controlled or coddled.
This is really making me rethink my own approach to parenting. It's so easy to fall into the trap of wanting to protect my kids from every discomfort, but I'm starting to see how that might actually be doing them a disservice in the long run.
It's a common struggle, and it goes against our natural instincts to want to shield our children from pain. But Mason believed that by allowing them to experience discomfort in a safe and supportive environment, we're actually helping them develop the inner strength and resilience they need to flourish.
That makes sense. So discomfort is one key ingredient for creating those transformative learning experiences that we were talking about earlier. What else did Mason emphasize?
Well, she talked a lot about the importance of observation and sensory experiences. She believed that children learn best through direct engagement with the world around them, not just through books or lectures.
So it's about getting kids out into nature, letting them explore, use their senses, get their hands dirty.
Exactly. She encouraged parents and educators to provide children with opportunities to observe nature closely, to notice the subtle variations in colors, shapes, sounds, smells, to really see the world around them.
That sounds lovely. It's like a reminder to slow down and appreciate the simple beauty of nature. We could all probably benefit from that. But how does this connect to learning? I mean, it's not like we can learn everything we need to know just by looking at a tree, right?
Of course not. But Mason believed that sensory experiences are foundational to all learning. She said that the mind feeds on ideas, and ideas are stored up in the brain in a way that no one understands. But we know that the only way to stock the mind with ideas is through the avenues of seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, smelling.
So those sensory experiences are like laying the groundwork for more complex learning.
Exactly. They're providing the raw materials that the mind uses to build understanding. And Mason believed that this kind of sensory learning is especially important in the early years when children's brains are developing so rapidly.
It makes me think about how much time kids spend in front of screens these days. They're getting all this visual stimulation, but it's not the same as engaging with the natural world, right?
Right. Screens can be great for certain things, but they can also be very passive and overstimulating. Mason would argue that we need to balance screen time with plenty of opportunities for children to engage with the natural world using all of their senses.
So getting them out into nature, letting them explore, get their hands dirty, make mud pies, build forts, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And it's not just about nature either. Mason also emphasized the importance of exposing children to great art, music, literature, anything that engages their senses and sparks their imagination.
So it's about creating a rich and stimulating environment that feeds their minds and souls. That's a beautiful thought. But I also want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, the importance of parents cultivating their own intellectual and spiritual lives. I think a lot of parents, myself included, struggle to find time for that kind of self-care. Any advice from Mason on how to make that happen?
Well, she wouldn't have called it self-care, but she absolutely believed that parents need to be lifelong learners themselves. She saw it as essential not just for their own well-being, but for their children's education as well.
So it's not selfish to carve out time for our own learning and growth.
Not at all. In fact, Mason would argue that it's one of the most selfless things we can do as parents. When we model a love of learning for our children, when we show them that we're still curious and engaged with the world, we're giving them a priceless gift.
That's a great point. And it makes me think about the importance of being intentional about the kind of environment we're creating in our homes. Are we creating a space where learning is valued and celebrated? Are we modeling a love of reading, of exploration, of intellectual curiosity? Or are we sending the message that learning is something you do in school and then forget about once you graduate?
Those are great questions to reflect on. And I think Mason would encourage us to think about our homes as living educational environments. Places where learning is happening all the time, not just during designated study hours.
So it's not about creating some rigid homeschooling schedule, but about weaving learning into the fabric of everyday life.
Exactly. It's about having dinner table conversations about interesting topics, taking family trips to museums and historical sites, reading aloud together, exploring nature in our backyards, all the things that make life rich and meaningful.
I love that. It's like learning becomes less about checking boxes and more about cultivating a lifestyle of curiosity and exploration.
That's the essence of what Mason was all about. And it's a journey we can all embark on together.
This has been so enlightening. I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together. The divine teacher, the emphasis on habit formation, the power of natural consequences, the importance of sensory experiences, and the role of parents as lifelong learners. It's a beautiful, holistic vision of education.
It is, and it's one that I think is more relevant than ever in today's world.
We've covered so much ground in this deep dive, but I feel like we've only just scratched the surface. I'm sure our listeners have tons of questions and reflections bubbling up. We'll be back in part 3 to tackle some of those questions and explore a few more of Mason's more provocative ideas.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Charlotte Mason's Parents and Children. We've been exploring some pretty revolutionary ideas about education, and I'm eager to keep unpacking this with you.
Me too. It's not every day you get to dust off ideas from the late 1800s and find them surprisingly relevant to modern life.
Before the break, we were talking about creating a living educational environment at home, which really resonated with me. I think a lot of parents feel pressure to make learning happen in a very structured, formal way. But Mason seems to be suggesting that it can be so much more organic than that.
Exactly. She believed that learning should be integrated into the fabric of everyday life, not confined to textbooks and worksheets. And you mentioned that this involves parents being lifelong learners themselves, which got me thinking, what if a parent isn't naturally drawn to learning? I mean, not everyone is a bookworm or a history buff.
That's true, but remember, Mason wasn't saying that every parent needs to be a scholar. It's more about cultivating an attitude of curiosity, a willingness to learn and grow, and that can look different for everyone.
So it's not about forcing yourself to read books you hate. but maybe about finding things that genuinely spark your interest and then sharing that passion with your kids.
Exactly. It could be anything: gardening, cooking, woodworking, bird watching, whatever lights you up. The important thing is that you're modeling a love of learning, showing your kids that it's a lifelong journey, not something that ends when you finish school.
That's encouraging. It takes the pressure off, doesn't it? It's not about being perfect or having all the answers, but about showing up with a curious mind and a willingness to learn alongside your kids.
That's the beauty of it. Learning becomes a shared adventure, a way to connect with your kids and with the world around you.
Speaking of shared adventures, one thing I wanted to touch on is Mason's view of fairy tales. She was surprisingly supportive of letting kids immerse themselves in these fantastical worlds, which seems a bit counterintuitive coming from someone who emphasized truth and discipline.
I know. It surprised me too at first. But when you think about it, fairy tales are full of those big, powerful ideas we were talking about earlier. Good versus evil, courage, perseverance, the importance of keeping promises. These are themes that resonate deeply with children, and they can be powerful tools for shaping character.
So it's not about escaping from reality, but about exploring these big ideas in a safe and imaginative way.
Exactly. And Mason believed that children's imaginations are so powerful that if we don't provide them with healthy outlets, they'll create their own, often to the detriment of their real-world experiences.
That makes sense. It's like giving their imaginations a place to play so they don't have to invent their own alternative realities.
Exactly. And fairy tales with their archetypal characters and timeless themes can actually help children make sense of the complexities of the real world.
That's a great point. It's not about shielding them from difficult realities, but about giving them tools to process those realities in a way that's meaningful and empowering.
And I think that's a key takeaway from Mason's work overall. It's not about creating a sanitized, easy world for children, but about equipping them with the skills and habits they need to navigate the challenges of life with courage, resilience, and a sense of wonder.
Yeah, it's a beautiful vision, isn't it? And it's one that challenges us as parents and educators to think differently about the purpose of education.
It certainly does. It's not just about academics, but about forming the whole person, nurturing their intellect, their character, their spirit.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm struck by how much Mason's ideas resonate with what we're starting to understand about child development and learning today, even though she was writing over a century ago.
It's amazing, isn't it? It's like she was tapping into something timeless, something that speaks to the essence of what it means to be human.
And it leaves me feeling hopeful, like we're on the right track rediscovering these ancient truths about learning and finding new ways to apply them in our modern world.
I feel that too. And it's a journey we don't have to take alone. There's a whole community of parents and educators who are inspired by Mason's ideas and who are finding creative ways to bring them to life in their homes and classrooms.
That's so encouraging. And for all of you listening, if you're intrigued by what you heard today, I encourage you to explore Charlotte Mason's work for yourself. It's a treasure trove of wisdom and insight.
And remember, you don't have to do it all at once. Start small, pick one idea that resonates with you, and see where it takes you. You might be surprised by what you discover.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Charlotte Mason's parents and children. We hope you've been as inspired and challenged by her ideas as we have.
It's been a pleasure exploring this with you, and we hope you'll continue to join us as we delve into more fascinating topics in future episodes.
Until next time, keep those minds curious, those hearts open. And remember, the journey of learning is a lifelong adventure, one that's best shared with others.